All right, so here we go. So today we're gonna introduce the respiratory system. So over the last few weeks in this course, we'll be going over systems. Okay. So today we'll start with this system, the respiratory system. Now I want to first distinguish the, between the two things: respiratory versus breathing. Sorry, respiration versus breathing. Okay, they're not the same thing. So don't confuse these two things. They're different. Respiration is gas exchange. So what that means is you like through something like diffusion. Let me just get a pen out here. So through diffusion, gases will move out of a cell and into a cell. So normally we think about a cell requiring oxygen. So oxygen will diffuse in. While if you remember, it's because the mitochondria needs oxygen, but it produces CO2. So that would be gas exchange. It's the swapping out of oxygen for carbon dioxide. And that occurs through diffusion. Now that is different than breathing, okay? Breathing is the act of moving air. Now I shouldn't just say air, but any sort of a fluid, okay? So because we're thinking, we're human, so we move air, right? Okay, it's fine. So it's the act of moving air for us. But for something like a fish, it's a little, obviously fish don't breathe air. So what they do is I guess you could say they breathe water. So how does that work? Well, basically, if you notice the mouth opens, and as the mouth opens, the gills close. So as this opens, the gills close. So what happens? Water goes in, and then water comes out of the gills, right? So whereas we move air, fish move water. So we breathe air, we could say fish breathe water. It's not the same thing as gas exchange, okay? So we're going to come back to breathing. We're going to look at how it works for us, for humans. But I just want you to know the difference between those two terms, respiration versus breathing. Because not all things breathe, okay? All things that need oxygen must exchange gas, but they don't have to breathe. Okay, so for example, if I look at this side, it says, what do all these things, I spelled organisms wrong, how embarrassing is that? Organisms. I can hear Rainey laughing in the background. Okay, what do all these organisms have in common? Well, they don't breathe. So what are these things? Top left corner is a type of aerobic bacteria. Oh, something in the chat here. You are laughing in the background, eh, Rainey? Okay, so that's a type of aerobic bacteria. This is something called Hydra. This is something called planaria. This is a worm, an earthworm specifically. There's different types of worms. And this is something called a sponge. For you SpongeBob fans, okay? Now, what do they all do? They all exchange gases with their environment. So they all take in oxygen and they all get rid of CO2, okay? But they don't breathe. None of these things on the slide breathe. They don't move air or water in and out like we need to do, like fish need to do, okay? All right, so respiration is gas exchange, right? And the two gases that we exchange are oxygen and carbon dioxide. So oxygen and CO2. So when we hear of the term aerobic, aerobic means that we need oxygen. The term aerobic cellular respiration is what occurs in the mitochondria. That's, if you recall, we mentioned that before. That's the process of using oxygen to make energy. Now, you'll learn about how that works, like the mechanism in grade 12. I think you might touch on it a little bit in grade 11, if I remember correctly, but you'll learn really how it works in grade 12. It's actually a pretty spectacular process. Okay, so so this whole process of bringing in oxygen, we're gonna focus on the lungs and how the lungs do this, but fish do the same thing because basically gills kind of like lungs. They do the same thing. They may not work exactly the same way, but they do the same thing. So whereas lungs allow for the exchange of oxygen and CO2 through air, gills do that through water. Okay, because water has oxygen in it also, just not as much. There's way more oxygen in air than there is in water, but gills kind of work the same way. In fact, if you look at gills, you'll notice that they're full of blood. And the reason why they're full of blood is because just like lungs are actually full of blood too. In fact, if I was to show you like an image of your lungs, so this is inside your lungs, see, full of blood vessels, okay? And so why are lungs full of blood vessels and why are gills full of blood vessels? Because they both do the same thing. What gills and lungs both do is they allow for oxygen to get into the bloodstream. And they allow for carbon dioxide to get out of the bloodstream. And that's the whole gas exchange process. So they don't work exactly the same way, but they do essentially the same thing. And that's why they're full of blood, because that oxygen has to get into your circulatory system. And we'll talk about how that works, okay? So we're going to talk about the lungs and how they work, but kind of works the same way in gills. All right. Oh, by the way, one of the problems with gills is because gills are actually external. Okay, even though it says the fish here, the gills are internal, but kind of still outside the body because you can see them. Is that they dry out. So, if we take a fish out of water, you hear the expression "fish out of water." Gills, they don't work outside water. They dry out, and when they dry out, they actually don't work. So that's why they have to be kept like covered or they're kept in water, and hence that expression "fish out of water," because they can't breathe air, even though they have gills that kind of work the same as lungs do. So lungs are internal. The reason why they're internal is because they're kept wet. So the fact that the lungs are inside your body keeps them wet. And that's a really important point. Lungs and gills do not work if they're dry. Okay? The membrane that allows for gas exchange doesn't work. It's a key feature of gas exchange. But we're not going to really go into too much detail about that. You just have to trust me on that. That it has to be kept wet for it to work. If it's dry, it doesn't work. Okay, so we will talk about breathing. We'll look at the how it works. So I'm going to come back to this. This is just basically the pathway or the flow of air, the direction it goes in. Basically, we know where it enters, things like your nostrils, for example. And this is where it ends, something called the alveoli. So here's an image of that. Okay. So you can see the entry point of air. So this is breathing now. Remember, breathing is the act of moving air. So air enters your mouth or your nose and travels down. You can see here something called the trachea or the windpipe, not the esophagus, that's digested. And it enters these smaller tubules and eventually into things that are smaller than that, called bronchioles. Kind of looks like grapes. You ever seen grapes? They have the stem and they have little stems, and The reason why I mentioned grapes is because at the end of the bronchioles, you see these things, which kind of look like grapes. These are called the alveoli, okay, which is plural. Alveolus is singular. So the air ends up filling these things called alveoli. That's plural, okay? So this is actually the structure where the gas exchange occurs. So the air goes into the alveoli, and what happens is the oxygen will go. So remember, so let's actually back up a little bit. When you're breathing in air, air has a lot of oxygen and it has very little carbon dioxide. So what that means is that when you breathe in air and the air goes into the alveoli have a lot of oxygen. Okay. And they also have very little carbon dioxide. So what happens then is the oxygen goes through the membrane of the alveoli. So here's a cross section. Remember we talked about this, I think, when we looked at tissues. This is made up of epithelial cells, the squamous ones, the ones that are flat. So what happens is the oxygen will diffuse in through that membrane. So if I was to like maybe draw this out on a whiteboard so you can see this, imagine that this is the alveoli. Okay, so when you breathe in, you're breathing in a lot of oxygen because air has a lot of oxygen, and you're breathing in a little bit of carbon dioxide, not much. Okay, now the alveoli has a membrane around it because it's made up of cells. So, the membrane is made up of cells. So what happens then is the oxygen is going to diffuse into the cell because the cell is going to have low oxygen. So the cell will have low oxygen, but high CO2. So diffusion says things move from a high concentration to a low concentration. So the oxygen is going to want to diffuse into the cell, and the carbon dioxide is going to want to diffuse out of the cell. That way, what happens is the amount of oxygen will decrease in the alveoli as it diffuses into the cell, but the amount of CO2 then in the alveoli will increase as the CO2 diffuses from the cells into the alveoli. That's important because then when you breathe out, what's happening when you breathe out is you're breathing out more CO2 and less oxygen, which is the exact opposite compared to when you're inhaling. So this is that whole process of gas exchange, okay? Let's go back to this. Now, when the gases are exchanged, so if I look at this diagram, you'll notice that there's like blood vessels surrounding the alveoli. Now, the reason why is because we want that very valuable oxygen gas to get into this very important cell that we talked about before, the red blood cell. All right. So look how thin this alveolus is. Well, look at the membrane. It's super thin because the cells are made of squamous epithelial cells that are flat. So notice how thin they are. And the reason why they have to be thin is because if you remember, we mentioned diffusion is really slow. It's very slow. So you want the oxygen to be able to get through that membrane. So notice how thin it is. We want to be able to get into these red blood cells. If the membrane is too thick, let's imagine the membrane is thicker, like this. Then what happens is it just takes too long for the oxygen to get through. Now, there are certain respiratory conditions that will do this. And in fact, I don't want to give it away because I think that's actually one of the questions in Slippett's assignment about respiration. You have to watch a video clip and talks about different diseases, but you can see the mechanism, right? If this disease causes the membrane to thicken for whatever reason, then it takes too long for the oxygen to get into your blood. And what that means then is that you will get less oxygen into your red blood cells, which obviously is not a good thing, right? Because we need oxygen because, we need that oxygen to make energy, all right? So the alveoli are full of blood vessels because we want to get the oxygen into the bloodstream as quickly as possible. That's why the membranes are so thin, so that they can get in very, very fast, okay? Here's another beautiful cross-section of this. You can see the alveoli. It's basically empty sacs. I shouldn't say empty, but obviously a gas in there. But you can see there's a lot of space. And that makes sense because we want to fill this up with air that has, again, lots of oxygen and very little carbon dioxide, so that the oxygen can diffuse in through that membrane into the blood vessel, and the carbon dioxide can diffuse out so we can exhale it. All right. Now, you'll notice that there's the thing about the alveoli is there's millions of them. And the reason why there's millions of them is because the more there are, the more surface area there is to absorb oxygen. So like imagine this is a slide of the alveoli, right? So what happens when you breathe in, the alveoli fill up with air. So again, you have all that oxygen in these sacs, right? Now, you'll notice there's all this membrane. So what happens is the oxygen goes through the membrane and into your bloodstream, okay? So it's gonna find its way. Remember that we talked about this with the cell membrane. The cell membrane is the exchange membrane for the cell. Now, the more surface area it has, remember we talked about this, it would be like a bigger doorway, right? And the bigger the doorway, the faster things can get through the doorway. So if you look at the slide, you'll notice there's lots of membrane surface area, right? The reason why there's so much surface area is because the more surface area there is, the faster the oxygen gets through. I think we mentioned that when we talked about the role of surface area with the cell membrane. So that's an important physical structure. You can see then, we can ask actually a really important question. We already addressed the first one. Why must the exchange membrane be thin? And that's because if it's thin, the gas can get through quickly. If it's thicker, it takes longer. In fact, it follows a square law. So if you actually double the distance, it actually takes x squared the amount of time. So it wouldn't be double the time, it'd actually be 4 times. If the distance of the membrane increases by a factor of 3, it would take 9 times longer to get through. Again, that means you're getting less oxygen. So that's why it's got to be thin. That's supposed to be surface area. Rainy, stop laughing. Why must there be a high surface area? Because the higher the surface area, the faster the oxygen gets in. So then we can ask a question like, well, then what do you think the problem is with someone who has emphysema? So emphysema, you'll notice actually there's 2 issues. One, you'll notice a lot of the membrane is missing. So whenever in the previous slide you saw like lots of membranes, right? You'll notice there's a lot of areas where there's no membrane. So a lot of that surface area has been destroyed, gone. So that means someone with emphysema has less surface area, which means takes longer to get oxygen into the bloodstream. So that's bad. But it also says on this slide that their alveoli have been enlarged. So it looks like some of the membrane is actually thickened. This looks like it's actually gotten thicker. So if that's the case, then we have two problems. One is there's less membrane, less surface area, but there's also thicker membrane, which means it takes longer to get through. So we got a double whammy, which kind of means, I guess, to simplify, someone with emphysema is going to get a lot less oxygen into the bloodstream. So what would they need to compensate? They would probably need to wear something like an oxygen tank to get more oxygen into their bloodstream if they can't get enough through air. So there's actually an interesting connection then if we think about your alveoli and things like your brain is folding. The act of folding things actually gives you more surface area. So your brain has a lot of surface area because it's folded. Your alveoli have a lot of surface area because they're folded into little bubbles. And these are villi, which we will look at when we get to the digestive system. They're also folded because they do something similar to what alveoli do. Alveoli allow you to absorb oxygen. They allow you to absorb nutrients. So it's true that, if alveoli have more surface area, they bring in oxygen more effectively. Same thing with villi. So things that have more surface area can move things through them with greater speed. So you'll see that connection when we get to the digestive system. We'll come back to that. Okay, so we mentioned breathing is different than respiration. So I actually just do want to end with breathing itself. Like, how does it work? So I'm going to show you an animation because the way it works is actually quite simple. And you'll notice a lot of things probably use this concept. So I'm going to show you this. I don't know why she's squinting. She's looks like she's in pain. Okay, so how does it work? All right, so let's take a look. So here's your respiratory system. We can we can scroll over the parts. So this is something called your pharynx. This is the part back of your mouth that connects the respiratory system with the digestive system. So that's actually important because that means that sometimes food, which is supposed to go down, your esophagus, gets actually stuck in your trachea because there's actually a little flap here that prevents food from going down the trachea. But sometimes, stuff happens. There's your bronchi and bronchioles. The bronchi are actually the bigger, and then the smaller things are the bronchioles. Here's the chest wall. Here are your lungs. So your lungs would be full of, again, alveoli, right? Those little grape-like structures. And then down here is something called your diaphragm. This is a really, really important muscle, okay? So how does breathing work? So understand breathing, you have to understand a little bit of chemistry. Oh, I heard some crying. Is that Florence? Florence, are you crying? So to understand breathing, you have to understand a little bit of chemistry, okay? There is a connection between pressure and volume, all right? And the connection is this. As the volume increases, so right now, got something in the chat here. Okay, so watch this. See this little box? I'm going to pause it. See, this little box has a volume, okay? I mean, you're only seeing 2 dimensions, but it would have 3 dimensions, right? So it has a particular volume. And you'll notice that the pressure is, don't worry about the number. Number's not important. It's at some value called 760 atmospheres, okay? Well, actually, this will be, sorry, millimeters mercury. Millimeters mercury, okay? Don't worry about that. It's not important. Now, you'll notice what happens when the box gets bigger. When the box gets bigger, the pressure drops. See that? Pressure is decreased. Let's watch that again. So here's the pressure right now. It's up here. Box gets bigger. Pressure goes down. Okay? So they're inversely proportional. What that means is simply as pressure goes up, sorry, other way around. Let's look at it from the point of view of the volume. As the volume goes up, the pressure goes down. Okay? The reverse is true. As the volume goes down, the pressure goes up. Okay? Yeah, okay? So they're inversely proportional. So as the volume goes up, pressure goes down. As the volume goes down, pressure goes up. Now, what you should know is that air moves from high pressure to low pressure. Kind of like diffusion. Diffusion moves from high concentration to low concentration. Air moves from high pressure to low pressure. So the way a syringe works, if I have a syringe and I want to pull fluid into the syringe, what I have to do is I have to pull on that plunger, because when I pull on the plunger, what happens is that I increase the volume in here. So for example, if the plunger is pushed, let's say the plunger is pushed all the way down. So let's say this is the syringe, okay? And the plunger is pushed all the way down. So here's my plunger, okay? Looks something like this, okay? So right now that you can see the plunger is pushed all the way down. When I pull up on the plunger, what happens then is the volume inside increases. So if I pull that plunger back, so if I pull on that handle and pull it back, then all this space now, that volume has increased. So what does that mean? That means that inside my syringe, I forgot to draw the needle. Inside my syringe, the volume has increased. If the volume is increased, that means the pressure has gone down. And what does it have to do with anything? Well, if you want to take in fluid, let's say I want to pull fluid from a person, well, now the fluid is going to flow into the needle because the fluid is going to move from a high pressure to a low pressure. The reverse is true. If you want to inject somebody with, say, a vaccine, then you push the plunger in. Why? Because when you push the plunger in, the volume decreases. As the volume decreases, the pressure goes up. As the pressure goes up, the fluid goes into the skin, right? Or through the skin. This is important because this is how breathing works. So if I look, oops, sorry, backed up a little bit here. So how does breathing work? Okay, so what happens when you breathe is, so take a look here. So this is your thoracic cavity. We'll just call it the chest cavity, okay? Now, the volume in here will decrease or increase, all right? When it decreases, we know pressure goes up. When it increases, pressure goes down. So take a look here. So you'll notice when we inhale, watch this. So you inhale, the volume goes up. You exhale, the volume goes down. So watch. So look at the space here. Okay. Inhale, volume goes up. Exhale, volume goes down. Now, what's going on? So there's a big muscle here called your diaphragm. What that does when you inhale, you can see it pulls down, and that causes the chest volume, the thoracic cavity to increase. What does that mean? That means the pressure goes down here. When the pressure goes down, then air rushes in. That's inhalation. So when you inhale, diaphragm pulls down, lung volume expands, air rushes in. A lot of people think that the air rushing in is what causes the lungs to expand. It's not. It's actually the diaphragm pulling down, increasing the volume of that lung cavity, which causes the drop in pressure, allowing the air to go in. When you exhale, the diaphragm relaxes, the volume decreases, the pressure goes up, and it forces the air out. That's breathing mechanics. And it kind of, if you go back to the clip about the fish, actually it's a very similar idea. So what happens then, the way fish breathe is the mouth opens. When the mouth opens, the volume increases in the mouth, so the pressure goes down. Air, it's not good. Water rushes in to the mouth, and then the mouth closes. Now, when the mouth closes, it creates a high pressure in the mouth, and it forces the water through the gills. So the way fish breathe is the same mechanism. The difference is they're obviously not moving air, they're moving water. But the idea is that it works by pressure. So when you inhale, diaphragm contracts, pulls down, the chest cavity expands, the pressure lowers, air rushes in. When you exhale, the opposite. Diaphragm relaxes, the volume decreases, the pressure inside increases, and the air rushes out. Okay? So that's it. We covered the difference between respiration and breathing. We looked at some features of your respiratory system, talked about gas exchange, why the membranes need to be thin, and why there's a high surface area. So that is it for today. Let me stop recording. Take any questions if there are any, okay?